Let's dive in. Thanks, everybody. We really appreciate you coming today. This is our last catch up for the year. We're very fortunate to be joined by the Globus team. Uh, just for those that haven't come to one of these sessions before, my name is Greg Darcy. I'm from aarnet. Generally kick off with a brief introduction, and then we have a presentation where we look at a case study or use case. And today we're really fortunate to be joined by Ada Nicolaitis from Globus. Ada is the software engineering manager, so she's going to give us a really comprehensive look at flows and what can be done there. And then after that, we'll throw it open to office hours questions. So we're looking forward to having that discussion. Okay. So for the benefit, I'm assuming everyone knows why we're here, but for the benefit of those who may not have joined one of these sessions before, today we'll be hearing, as I mentioned, from the Globus team, and I'm sure everyone's pretty familiar with Globus, given that it's an industrial grade data transfer tool that is ideally suited for large data research workflows. A little bit about us. We're aarnet, and again, assume people know who we are. We're Australia's NREN, so we both non-profit companies. aarnet, we run the network that connects the universities, and we're owned by all the universities in the CSIRO. So how do these things come together? Well, we, as aarnet, we would want to see that all our stakeholders and owners are getting best use of the network. So through our partnership with Globus, you can have a Globus subscription, and within that subscription, you can have unlimited usage and endpoints. And as people would probably know, there's different levels of subscription, being high assurance and HIPAA, and various cloud connectors. More than happy to answer any more. If anyone's got any questions about these, answer them later or offline. But I'm assuming this is pretty common knowledge, so I didn't want to waste too much time. What I really want to do is actually sort of come into focus in terms of, well, what's the problem we're trying to solve here? Why this partnership between aarnet and Globus? And essentially what I suppose we all want to do is with supporting research. So we'd much rather see researchers being able to get on with the task of doing their research rather than struggling with data movement, and those responsible for managing the facilities rather than their time being taken up, that ability to quite simply and seamlessly transfer data is something I think we're all aspiring to. David, this is your slide you might recognize. So for me, I really like this slide because I think it really kind of captures, I suppose, in a sense, the workflows, but in again that the relationships in terms of how data is generated, how it needs to be moved and managed. And as I mentioned, I think Globus is a fantastic tool for this, and it facilitates the end-to-end automation of complex workflows. So as we can see here, you know, from generating at the instrument to then moving to facility storage, the challenges now, especially in terms of a distributed infrastructures, is being able to get that data to where it's needed in a manageable fashion. That's my brief. Just in terms of a quick update since our last meeting, we ran a Globus workshop at eResearch conference a couple of months ago, where we attracted 26 people from 17 institutions. And by and large, we think it was highly successful. It seems like the time's right. People are very interested at the moment in terms of how they can help automate and better manage their data movement tasks. We ran a pre-workshop survey, so that's what you see there in the little bubble. And I picked this one out because I thought it pretty much summed up, I suppose, the sentiment of people that were there on the day. We had people responsible we had data governance people, we had systems admins, we had quite a spread, but basically people who want to, I suppose, again, support their institution and support their researchers, and really to get a better understanding of Globus and the potential of Globus in being able to then pass that advice on to their own researchers. Uh, what's coming up next year? We're having a subscriber roundtable, which will just be an online meeting. I'm sure some of the people on this call may have already been invited to that. We just want to sort of bring people together to understand, where are the common pain points, where can we help support and work with you on that. And also in terms of your self-managed subscriptions, just making sure everyone's across that, what can be done. And next year, one of the bits of feedback we've had from the workshop and more broadly in our discussions is the notion of this local community, in that everyone's working on common problems. So how can we come together to exchange knowledge, to support each other, and hopefully progress things? Which for me is my perfect segue into handing over to Ada.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ada Nicolaitis. I am an engineering manager at Globus. I am the manager for the Automate team. And so, while today we're going to be talking about flows, you will hear me mentioning a bunch of other tools as well that exist within kind of our automation ecosystem. And so there are a number of things to think about when you consider automating with Globus and using these tools, and consider that flows can be a solution by itself, but in other cases it might be part of a comprehensive solution where you're using multiple tools together to build something depending on the case. And so we'll talk about that a little bit, and I'll kind of refer to some of the places where there are interactions between each of these tools and how they might fit together. So what I'm going to do is my plan for today is I would like to give a bit of an intro, just give a sense of what flows is, talk about some of the key concepts, and importantly, when to use it. And ideally, I'd like to focus on kind of a grasp of the terminology and building up your mental model about what happens when a flow runs, and give you a bit of a sense of or an intuition around what are the places where this fits in and the types of tasks that this could be useful for. As Greg had mentioned, there is going to be some time for Q&A at the end. And I also want to mention, I'll mention a couple times that there is documentation on our doc site as well. We are adding to it all of the time. We'll take a quick look at it probably at some point, just to give you a sense of some of the things that you can find there. But that will be helpful as you start to expand and potentially run and author some of your own flows, getting a sense of all of the pieces there and all of the things that you have control over in the authoring experience. So for starters, what is Globus Flows? So Flows is a service for creating and managing hosted automations called Flows. It is a platform for managed, secure, reliable task orchestration. And one of the things that it allows you to do as a managed service is, in addition to being able to run and execute these repeatable automations, it also allows you to share with users and groups. And so we'll kind of talk about what a flow is, and we'll talk about what running a flow is, and kind of each of these different components of it. But importantly, this allows you to share and delegate access to those flows. And so you can build up units of this hosted functionality and then share those automations out with different levels of permissions, whether it's for other folks to administer them, or whether that's for individual users or groups of users to be able to run them and perform repeated tasks. Okay, we've got the flow service, but what is a flow? In essence, a flow is a sequence of steps, but it has some really important characteristics to it that make it really valuable for certain types of automation. First off, it is hosted. It runs on the Globus platform. So this isn't something that you install locally. You don't need to be in charge of operating it yourself. We host it, and it is accessible through the web app, through the CLI, through our Python SDK, and also via a REST API. You're going to hear me say that kind of incantation, that string of things multiple times today, but one of the things that I want to make sure that I get across is by making it available in all of these different places, as I sort of was suggesting at the outset, there is the ability to compose it with other pieces. And so you, for instance, might have a Python script that then launches a flow or multiple flows and allows us to run asynchronously. You might have a bash script that kicks things off or makes updates to your flow definition. So there are a number of different ways that you can interact with these and combine these tools together to build up a full solution. Um, in addition to being hosted, it is reusable. So you can rerun a flow multiple times with varying input. And when you define a flow, you have the ability to say what types of input that it accepts and set some restrictions around that. And so that allows you both to create some predictability around what your input is going to look like, as well as creating some interfaces for users to use when they run the flow. And we'll take a look at what those interfaces look like. In addition to that, it is flexible. So it is a state machine. It can store and manipulate state like variables, and it can have its own built-in decision logic that allows it to branch out and transition into different paths through that code. So, I mean, in a lot of ways, it is like building up an application. It is also shareable. So as I mentioned before, it can be shared with other users and groups, and we have multiple types of distinct roles that are defined that you can take advantage of. And it can also present a customizable interface via the Globus web app. And so in addition to being available through things like the CLI and the SDK, you can actually, if you provide an input schema, so defining what your input is, you get a nice web renderable form that people can interact with and has some really cool functionality built into it to make it easy to use and to launch new runs of that flow. In short, you can think of flows as applications hosted on the Globus platform. And so each time you use that flow, it's going to operate over a sequence of steps in a specified order. And that allows for automation of complex interactions across multiple services. How do you use it? Each time a flow is executed, we call this a run. You can start new runs from, and I'm going to keep repeating this, the web app, from the CLI, from the Python SDK, and using the REST API. And so a lot of different ways to launch these things and interact with it. Each of these runs accepts input and then performs a series of actions in response. And then once you've launched that run, you can track detailed progress of each run in something called the event log. You also have the ability to manage individual runs. And so in addition to kind of looking at the event log, seeing what happens, being able to kind of debug and evaluate the what occurred over the course of it, it also gives you the possibility to share that out. And so in addition to sharing flows with people, you can also share runs with them to see that a particular operation was performed. And you can do that programmatically. Again, lots of different tools to be able to give access to it. So then, well, what are states and what are actions? One of the things that's helpful to know is an action is a special kind of state, and flows itself is built on top of AWS step functions. And so this has some important ramifications, but one of which is that when you define a flow, it uses what's called the states language. And so states language is something that we've inherited from step functions, but also extended quite a bit to add special types of states that allow some really helpful integration points and to be able to fully take advantage of other things inside of the Globus platform. From the states language, you get some things sort of out of the box. And so you get basic states like wait and pass and choice if you want to do branching and making decisions in there. But ultimately, the heart of flows are those actions. So what's an action? Actions are fundamentally operations that you can perform on other resources and services. And so this is the connective tissue that really makes flows such a useful tool for kind of gluing different service interactions together. And importantly, these operations are managed. And so what that means is they are hosted, they handle authentication, they validate input, and they manage interactions with services, store state, they handle retries when needed, and can request additional permissions. And so if it discovers that you do not have all the permissions you need in the course of performing that operation, it can actually come back and ask for additional consent to be granted. So there's a whole bunch of actions that we've provided just out of the box that you can use right away in your flow definitions. Just some quick examples. You can start a new transfer. You can delete files and folders. You can create a directory. You can list items in a collection. You can stat a particular item in a collection, either a file or a folder, to get more information. You can mint a digital object identifier with DataCite. You can ingest data into Globus Search. So for instance, if you are ingesting or processing data sets, you can then use that to automatically get those into a search index and make those searchable. Similarly, you can delete data in Globus Search if you need to clean things up. You can send a notification by email. You can wait for user input, and those two things are often used together to sort of set a breakpoint in a flow and wait for kind of a yes or no response. And so sending an email out with a link to a form. Some folks use that as an evaluation step during an interactive process where, say, data is coming off of instruments and you need to decide whether to continue an experiment or to end the experiment early and potentially change some parameters. You have the ability to set permissions on files and folders, and so sharing out with other users. Executing a function with Globus Compute. This is a super powerful one because Globus Compute then allows you to run arbitrary functions inside of flows. And so these two are a very, very powerful combination for kind of extending that functionality. And then creating a guest collection as well. So we talked a little bit about what a flow is, some examples of states and actions. What are some examples of flows? What are the types of things you can do with them? Well, we use the flows ourselves. In many cases, some of our services, we get requests from users to provide a particular type of functionality, and we say, well, this service actually already has all of the building blocks of that. All of the different operations are there, but the service doesn't compose them into that more complex interaction. And so I'll give you a couple examples of this, but generally when we encounter these sorts of things, often what we might do is we'll build them into what's called a Globus provided flow. And so this is a flow that is available on the platform. Anyone can potentially use. And it's already ready to go. You can also look at and inspect the definition and kind of see what's going on under the hood. And we'll run one of these later so you get a bit of a sense of kind of how to find these and what's there. First example of a Globus provided flow is a two-stage transfer. So in some cases, if you want to get to point A to point B in doing a transfer, the direct path between them may not be the fastest path for that transfer. And in fact, going to an intermediary may in fact prove quicker. So two-stage transfer is a response to this, where you can actually transfer between 2 points by using a middle collection as a hop. And so we'll kind of transfer to that intermediate collection and then transfer to the destination and then clean up the intermediate afterward. Another case that we've handled through a Globus provided flow is move. So in transfer, you have the ability to copy, you have the ability to delete, but transfer doesn't compose them into a single operation that cleans up the source after successfully transferring to the destination. That's something that we provide in a Globus provided flow. Similarly, we've added transfer and set permissions. Again, transfer provides these as individual operations that you can do, but through a Globus provided flow, you're actually able to compose those together. And so you can say, well, once this transfer is done, I automatically want to share it with a preset list of users and groups with particular permission levels. So you can kind of start to see how you can compose some of these different pieces together and create more complex functionality out of the building blocks that the services already give us through actions. So at this point, I'd love to hop in and take a look at some of the things I've been mentioning so we can actually see some of this concretely. So I'm going to hop over and everybody cross your fingers that the demo deities are with us. Before I go too much further, I do want to give a quick look. Uh, I mentioned the docs site. This is Globus Docs, so docs.globus.org. And in here in the APIs section, you will find flows. This is the homepage you'll land to. There is an absolute wealth of resources here. Excuse me. Some of this is getting started guide, so just kind of showing you how to use some of the different tools, the CLI and the web app to run flows or to author new flows. And then some of this gets really into the detailed weeds of how to write expressions, how to define flows, how to use some of the different states that you have available to you. So we're going to take a look at the Globus web app and see what's in here. And so inside of the Globus web app, over on the side, you've got a flows tab. And when you land in here, you will see a list of your recent runs. Up at the top, there are some important tabs for navigation. So you can kind of filter through your runs. You can filter down to failed runs and look through there. But you can also hop over to the library. The library are the flows that you have access to. And one of the checkboxes here is Globus provided flows. So these are the ones that I mentioned that you kind of get out of the box. And so for instance, this is the two-stage transfer. If you pull it up here, you can see on that landing page, you get a bunch of metadata that sort of describes what it is, what it does, different keywords that you can use to search for it by. You can also go through, and this is it can be a particularly handy thing. You can go through and you can inspect the definition and the input schema. Only certain roles are able to do this, but for the Globus provided flows, everyone who has access is able to do it. So you can create flows where your users don't necessarily have access to that. If you only give them a viewer permission, it kind of depends on case by case as to what roles are granted. So you can go through here, and in some cases, this can be useful to see, well, how did that flow pull this off? We also have some simplified versions in the doc site, so I would recommend taking a look at those. Most of our Globus provided flows, we've taken one where we've stripped out some of the kind of nice to have error handling and things like that, but then make them a little bit easier to understand. You can also see in here the roles page, so you can see who this is shared with. You can administer this. You can assign new roles if you yourself have an admin role on here. And let's go ahead and hop back out to that library because let's take a look. So one of the things I mentioned is this idea of defining an input schema. And there are a couple things that the input schema does for us that are super valuable. And the first of them I want to talk about is here. What the input schema is input schema is, for those of you who have used JSON schema, it is a JSON schema document, but basically it is a set of rules that define the type of input that your flow will accept. This is helpful. This is sort of like a function signature, from a programming language, in the sense of it is declaring what the allowable input is, and the tighter you make it, the more you can control the execution of your application, and the more predictable that is, and the less error handling you need in a lot of cases. So within here, we can go ahead, and because I have the right role on here, I'm allowed to start this. And so if I come in, one of the things that we can do from this input schema is the web app can actually automatically generate this nice form for us, because the web app knows what input is allowed for this flow. And in fact, it even knows which of these are required and which of these are optional. So in this case, the move flow, as I mentioned before, allows us to specify a source and a destination. It's going to perform a transfer to copy from the source to the destination. And when that succeeds, and only if it succeeds, it will go and clean up the source afterward. So one of the things that's nice about this form is this is not just basic controls, but a lot of these are smart controls that are provided through the Globus web app. So for instance, this is an enhanced control that knows that we are working with a collection, and it knows that it needs both the collection ID and the path for this transfer. So when I click in here and I type Globus tutorial, we should see Globus tutorial collection 1, and I can even get a file browser right in here. And so this is kind of what the web app is adding on top of this that gives us a really nice interface and a bunch of extra value for having gone to the effort of creating that input schema. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to transfer this demo folder over. And now let's pick a destination. So I'll transfer it to the other tutorial endpoint. So we'll send this tutorial collection 2, and I'll browse for a path. And yeah, let's go ahead and put it. Oh, I already have one of these. I'm just going to drop this right into that. Yeah, let's drop it inside of here. I think that's fine. We'll nest them together. Um, so these are optional. I don't need to fill these out. If you need to track your transfer tasks or delete tasks afterward, it can be helpful to label them. So that way you know where they're coming from. It will auto-generate a label if you don't provide one, so it's not necessary. I'm going to allow checksum verification to be on. And tags can also be useful for helping make these searchable and organizable. And so you can add comma separated tags here. And the last required item is labeling this run. And so I'm going to, we'll call this demo 1. Maybe we'll run more than one time. And as you can see, this was grayed out. And once I completed the last required field, now I can start it. And so let's go ahead and kick this off. All right, so at this point, you can see it's taken me to this page that says the run successfully started. I can kind of go back. I can start another run of this flow, but we're going to take a look at the run details. So up here, you can see that this is progressing, and this means it's in progress. And I can take a look at the event log. And so you can start to see each of these items in progress as the flow is moving through its operation. While it's doing that, let's take a look at a couple other things and then we'll come back. So you have a bunch of that metadata here that we created. We can also edit the run after we've created it. So if we wanted to update the label, realize we mislabeled it, or we need to add some more tags to it, that's still possible from here. We can also cancel it while it's in progress by saying terminate this run. And we can also add roles to it. And so for instance, if I wanted to share this out, I can add other managers who will have the ability to cancel it. This can be helpful for long running flows. Sometimes you might have an instrument producing data for a long period of time. And in fact, the flow is iterating over and incrementally, say, running a compute function to check and process some of that data and then initiating transfers based on that. So, being able, if that potentially runs for hours or even days, being able to get in there and cancel it and manage that can be quite helpful. Sometimes you also just need to give somebody the ability to view it. And that's what the monitor is for. It's effectively a read-only permission on this. I'm going to cancel out though and go back to this event log. Oh, one last thing. You can see a snapshot of the definition once you've run it. And so as the run owner, this gives you the ability to understand, especially historically, if your flow definition is changing over time, what did the flow look like at that point in time when it was run? Heading back to the event log, okay, we can see the flow succeeded. We've got a check mark there indicating that it passed. You can see all of the steps that were executed in the course of running this flow. So we've got from flow started, and this shows the initial input that was passed in from that form. We can see for each of these events that start, any start event, you can see what the input to that particular event was. This is useful for thinking about as you're building your flow definitions. What did I actually send into that action? What is it? What data is it operating on? Similarly, when you get these completed events, you can see what the data was that it actually produced. You can have you can have actions reference the output of prior actions. So sometimes these don't even come directly from the input that you give it, but refer to things that were created in the course of running. And so you're able to go through. Now, obviously, everything here succeeded, but if you had the case where one of these failed, this can be a useful place to go in and debug and figure out, well, what step did it hit? What went wrong? What was the input that step got? What was the error message that I got back out? And so this is often a good step for a good place to go for when you're encountering issues. In the past, historically, this has also been kind of the only place to sort of debug things other than just pure semantic errors in your JSON. However, over time, we've started to build up more tools to help you catch more types of errors quickly and debug things before you get to this step. One of the things that we've wanted to do is really tighten up that development cycle so that you don't need to every single time go through that process of kind of re-updating the flow and inputting all of your input again and doing another run and waiting for it to complete and then getting an error and then tweaking something and trying again. there's always going to be some of that. You are, in a certain sense, putting together an application. And so, with the application, it's interacting with lots of external services. And those do things that flows by itself cannot necessarily predict. However, there are a number of things we can do. So, one of the things I want to share with you is the Flows IDE. This is in beta. You will see the address is up here. It is that globus.github.io/flows IDE. We can make sure to share this out. But what this does is this provides some tools that are really helpful for developing flows and creating an integrated experience. And this is something that we're continuing to build up over time. Right now, it is not directly incorporated into the web app, but this experience may evolve. So keep in mind you're seeing a snapshot of something that's actively getting better and better over time. You've got two panes here. There's no content in here yet. But first thing to know is if you're just getting started, there's a ton of documentation here. And importantly, there's a lot of information on those different actions that are available. These are called action providers. And so you can see, for instance, within Globus transfer, make dir, managing permissions, delete, creating guest collections, getting collection info, creating a new transfer, etc. So this provides a nice single pane of glass where you can see a lot of the things that are available to you. Third-party action providers are not incorporated in here today, but you can see all of the ones that we offer from here and get a sense of what's available. And it also links you to a couple of our tutorials for a bit more information on how to author these things and what's required. So when I get into here, let's go ahead, and I mentioned that we can take a look and we can see that definition right off the bat. So if I take this definition, I'm going to hop over to diagram and I'm going to drop this in, you can immediately see a diagram of that flow. And if I go in, I can zoom around and I can see all of the different components and states that this can transition between. As your flow definitions get more complex, this is invaluable to make sure that you actually have created the potential paths through this definition that you think you've created, and kind of seeing when are you potentially going to fail states, what is your branching logic, where are those decisions being made. So this is a really, really handy thing to be able to do. And this updates in real time as you're changing your flow. And so if you go in here and you take steps out, you will see, or add new steps in, it'll update in real time. The other thing I want to point out in here that I think is useful is I've got just a real simple initial flow here. And if I go ahead and I hit validate, this should tell me invalid definition, unprocessable entity. So we got an error in here. Validate is a new function that we've added this year. Validate is part of the Flows API, and it helps us report more complex errors and more subtle errors that were harder to debug before. Part of what it does is it allows us to actually traverse all of the possible execution paths in that flow to catch inconsistencies between things. And when I mentioned the other really important thing that input schemas can do for you, one of them is giving more information to validate, to tell it what input you're expecting. And that makes validate quite a bit more powerful in terms of understanding what's reasonable data that it can expect to be able to reach into in your state. So if I come here, it's going to tell me, yep, there's nothing defined inside of states. And sure enough, in a basic flow definition, we've got to have some states for it to be able to do something. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to grab a state, and a couple states, and drop them in here. Let me hop back here. And you'll see I get nice IDE things. So I'm getting auto indentation. Let's drop that in. And I think it's unhappy about that because that is incorrect. And I believe that is incorrect. So there we go. And now it auto formats for us. And if we hit validate, okay, so we've got an invalid definition, 2 errors found. If we hover over these, missing property, action URL, that's a key part of an action that's missing. So then we start to see some information. Similarly, we're going to say missing action URL, missing type. So, we can satisfy some of these. We could say type action and immediately get feedback and see, okay, so, oh, that needed to be capitalized. And so you'll see kind of each of these things get resolved, right? So now type is gone. And so this gives you interactive feedback as you're going. And importantly, it's interacting with the live service. So it's working on the latest definition of what a valid flow looks like and can give you that kind of real-time feedback based on the action providers that you're using. Some of the types of things that this can do that weren't possible before when you run that validate is be able to look at things like, uh, are you referring to data that your input schema says cannot possibly be there? Are you creating things like infinite loops inside of your flow that could never possibly resolve? Are you branching to paths that might be invalid? And so only one path might contain an error in it. So there's a lot of really handy stuff in there that we believe can kind of provide a big boost and a big speed up to development and get you that feedback faster as you're developing it.
Now, I'm going to assume from that silence that perhaps it's not. Oh, there we go. Okay, Gareth. So, Gareth put a question in the chat that Gareth is from CSIRO. We have a user running large sync operations, and they have had problems with altering or removing source files before the transfer gets to them. Could flows be helpful to address this sort of self-inflicted issue?
Yeah, it sounds like it could be. There are a couple tools that are potentially there that you might be able to avail yourself of. One of the things that you could do, for instance, is if you're looking at doing some form of cleanup, either a priori or afterward, you have both the couple different tools in there from the actions. You have the creating the new transfer task. You also have the ability to create those delete tasks to clean things up. And there's also the transfer ls command. So if you've used transfer ls before, I mean, this is like ls in Unix, right? You're going to get a readout of everything at a particular path. And so that gives you the opportunity, for instance, to go through there, look at each of those files, in an automated way and sort of loop over them and identify things that say are potentially problematic files, clean them up on the source, and then transfer them over. Or alternatively, you could set up a transfer that itemizes only the items that you want to keep. And so you could sort of perform a little bit of a comprehension that boils that down to an explicit list, an allow list of files that you want to include in the task. And so instead of necessarily deleting them, maybe you just ignore them for the transfer and your transfer is fully itemized. So if I've understand that correctly, correct me if I've misunderstood any part, but I think there might be a couple different ways to go after that with flows.
Terrific. John, I see you've put a question in the chat. Is maybe your microphone working?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, that's terrific.
Okay, beautiful. The questions around transferring a large number of like small files, it could be 100,000, could be a million small files. Are there any limitations that we need to know about, or does it work with that scale of files?
Yeah, that should work just fine. In some cases, if it's lots of small files, we have had some folks for particular use cases do things like tarring those files up in advance and then sending those over. That can be something that Flows can help you with, for instance. And so, one way to potentially do that is with Globus Compute. You can actually tar those files in advance and package that up into a bundle and then send that bundle over. It kind of depends on a case-by-case basis as to what the most efficient way of doing things are, but that's definitely an option that is available to you and that Flows could assist with.
Okay, that's good. Thanks.
Terrific. Richard's got a question. Richard, do you want to?
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks for that. Great presentation. My question was just regarding ServiceNow integration. Is there a capability to integrate natively, or would it be trivial for us to develop that feature ourselves?
I'm not as familiar with ServiceNow. I might need a little bit more background. It might be possible that's something that would be worth a follow-up conversation offline, because I'd like to understand that and see if that's something that we might be able to do through any of our existing tooling, or possibly if not, maybe that's a feature request that we could look into.
Wonderful. Thank you for that.
Yeah, of course.
We can definitely help set that up. Jeff, you've got a question as well.
Yeah, actually, not really. I was just saying, but our experience with files that are going across, with where you've got a result set is anything up to 100 directories with 10,000 files. I mean, our experience is it's just a lot easier to tarball the whole thing down, create a manifest file and put it across. Now, this is particularly important if it's going to HSM, where the files are going to actually end up on tape. Because if the user goes back and says, oh, okay, I want my experiment, I've got to retrieve, 1,000 files. The HSM that we're using, if it's getting replaced, it will recall the files from tape one at a time. So do the math, 1,000 files, 3 minutes to retrieve. Where it's just a lot easier to pull back the tarball and they have a look at the manifest file and they can extract their own files.
Yeah, that's a great point, and definitely the tape case in particular is one that is super relevant for that. One of the things that I'm aware of as well is we have another user, Brock Palin, who has created an archive in tar tool that it can be integrated as well, and so that might be worth taking a look at if you're interested in following that case. I believe that tool is open source now. I could be mistaken, but I think he has shared that out.
Terrific. Anyone else have a question for Ada or more broadly across the Globus platform? I have one question in terms of, I mentioned at the outset, some of the research groups we're working with very much have that distributed infrastructure. So maybe generating the data at an instrument within a university, but then having to transport that data to a national HPC facility. So I'm just wondering too, in terms of authentication and that kind of thing, because you're literally moving from one system to another. I'm assuming Flows can handle that authentication?
Absolutely. So one of the things you can do inside of your flow definition, so you've got a couple options. Flows inherently, when the flow is launched, uses the identity of whatever launched it. So for instance, if you launch that flow, whether it's via the SDK or the CLI using client credentials, so say a service account, then the flow will actually operate using those service account credentials as that identity. And so you could potentially grant in those cases. Flows can also potentially use multiple identities in some cases using a feature called run as within states. And so in fact, if you need to change identities for particular steps in the middle of the flow, that's also available. That one gets a little bit more complicated, but I would say it's definitely a use case that a lot of folks are doing, so it's certainly possible. A lot of it is just making sure that you've got the right permissions on kind of all of the touch points.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you. I see. Thanks, Gareth, for putting that link in to Brock Palin's tool. So it's in GitHub. So hopefully that's open source. Any other questions?
One other thing that might be worth mentioning for the instrument use case, there is a repo that we have as well. Actually, I'll see if I can pull it up really quickly. I believe it's flows. Well, let's see if it comes up here. I think it's flows trigger examples. Oops. Globus flows trigger examples. There it is. So in here, this is also something that might be useful both for thinking about that instrument use case and thinking about, how to automate incorporation of an instrument into the Globus ecosystem. One of the things that this exemplifies is it provides a number of kind of different sort of code excerpts and flow pieces that you can use, but for performing common operations and actually watching a file system, for instance. And so if you watch for particular characteristics or flag files, you can then use these scripts to kick off a new run of a flow. And so that's another way potentially of bringing flows in. In some cases, as I mentioned, it's setting up a loop and having flows sit there and kind of continue to iterate over and watch your file system. But in another case, it could be something where you actually have something local watching the file system and then kicking off flows with different parameters in response to that. So a number of different ways to combine these tools.
That's terrific, really useful.
Um, Ada, thank you very much for the presentation. Just wondering, with something like the one you just discussed about the automated folder checking for updates or something, I presume that's the scenario we're discussing. That's a very common one, I think, amongst the instrument researchers. And I'm wondering if there's any thoughts about somehow surfacing that particular, like some ready-made flows within the web interface so that end users could self-provision that kind of, once with a little help from central support or IS, to say, oh, if you've got this use case where you've just got a folder that your instrument's dumping files into, to stage it to the local instrument computer, and you just want to then move it to our central network share, but have it do it in the background seamlessly. Anytime someone does a run, so to speak, they could just tick that checkbox in the particular interface section that's relevant, rather than doing the whole development cycle. Is that possible or crazy
Yeah,
talk?
so I mean, I would say this is kind of probably the closest thing to what you're describing that we have today. One of the keys is you do need some form of local agent to assist and initiate that. And so that's part of what these code examples provide, is actually showing what that agent might look like with a library called Watchdog. But that is an area that we are also very interested in continuing to explore, and doing some design work around, and thinking about, are there other things that we might be able to offer that package some of that up as well? So I don't have anything that I can, announce necessarily right now, but that is an area that we're continuing to focus on quite a bit, and a really important use case.
Thank you.
And if you have a facility that's interested in that, and you want to work with us on that, we'll help you, and we'll be happy to have a two-sided success story.
Appreciate that, Lev. Thank you.
That's terrific, Lev. Josh, you got the same use case there at Wollongong?
Yeah, same thing. We've got a folder that the instrument dumps all the the images coming off the microscope to, and then we have our own scripts at the moment that transfer that to central storage. And we do filtering based off research groups so that they land into different folders based on the research group name. But yes, sounded very similar to what Michael was talking about.
Yeah, I think as Philip mentioned, it sounds like it's quite a common use case for moving that data off instruments. Yeah, which is something we're hearing more about at the moment. Okay. Any final questions before we wind up and let the Globus team get about their evening? As if not, I'd just like to thank Ada, Lev, and Greg from Globus, and thank you specifically, Ada, for walking us through that today. I think there's quite a lot in there to sort of wrap your head around. As I mentioned in the workshop we ran at our National E-Research Conference, or the feedback was that people want to understand flows and want to start, I suppose, dipping their toes in the water. So I think you've provided a great overview of all the tools that are available, and making that start. And obviously, Lev's generous offer to help, because I'm sure as we move into next year, and as we try to launch and promote our local community, people are working on those common problems. The more we can come together to address those, the more utility and value it'll have across the board. So that's fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'd just like to, extend that offer as well. As you all are starting on your automation journey and kind of working through getting started with flows, please don't hesitate to reach out through support channels, and you'll get connected with somebody from the team who can help out and look into things. And if it's not possible, sometimes that turns into a feature request, and that informs what the things are that are on the roadmap too. So it's a two-way street, and we love to learn from you all as well. Where you're running into trouble, where there might be gaps. And so, don't hesitate to reach out.
Perfect. Okay, well, we'll wind it up there. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming along, and we look forward to seeing you in the new year.